Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar for Community Project Funding Grantees regarding forms and submission. I'm Randall Mullen with TDA Consulting, and I will further introduce the co-presenter momentarily. Before we begin presenting the content, I first want to cover a few logistics. If you've participated in prior CPF cohort webinars, you probably know this particular detail. All participants will be muted during the webinar, so you will all participate in listen mode. The PowerPoint presentation either has been or will be available to all participants. The slide deck will also be on the HUD Exchange soon after this webinar. You will find the slides and other resources on the recently launched CPF cohort landing page that is shown on this slide. Although you will participate in listen mode, you will want to actively participate and become fully engaged. You may submit content-related questions, that is, those on the topic of forms and submission, using the chat feature in Zoom, sending those questions to everyone. The co-presenter and I will monitor the chat and answer clarifying questions when possible as they are asked during the presentation. We will then pause at the end of each section of today's webinar and read aloud those frequently asked questions and orally answer them for all to hear. As in the prior webinars, we have also reserved time for a Q&A period toward the end of the presentation, where we'll invite HUD representatives to answer the more difficult questions and, of course, clarify what we as the presenters provided in earlier responses as necessary. Here's the agenda that we'll follow today. As I mentioned, we'll begin with introductions followed by a brief review of the prior cohort webinars, then begin our presentation on forms and submission, the topic of the day. After we cover those agenda items, we'll have the final question and answer period and then identify resources at the HUD Exchange to further guide your preparation of those forms and their submission to HUD. And then lastly, we'll invite you to complete an evaluation either before you end participation in the webinar or immediately afterwards. Okay, now I'll begin the introductions and tag my co-presenter who will introduce herself, and she will in turn tag the HUD representatives who are joining us today as well. Again, my name's Randall Mullen, and I'm with TDA Consulting, where I've worked for many years as both vice president and as a senior consultant on a wide range of housing and community development projects. I've recently assisted HUD in explaining guidance around special congressional appropriations. That work has included both recovery from natural disasters and response to the COVID-19 pandemic, plus recovery from its economic impacts. And now the CPF program. The co-presenter today is Jennifer Alpha. Jennifer, will you please introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm Jennifer. I'm with TDA Consulting as well. I'm a senior consultant here. I've been with TDA for about 12 years. Originally started my career as an attorney. So forms and regulatory documents are a favorite subject of mine. Like Randall, I also work on a variety of HUD programs doing policies and procedures, written agreements, planning documents, those types of things. And so I'm excited to be here. I saw you once before on the budget sessions that we just did. And so I'm happy to be back.
Thank you,
and
Jennifer.
With that, I will turn it over to Connor.
Hey everyone, my name is Connor LaRoe. I'm a program analyst with the Congressional Grants Division, primarily working on the technical assistance projects for CPF grantees, like the cohort sessions that you're on now. And I'm also serving as a systems officer, which is assisting the grant officers with their portfolio of grantees as it relates to getting grantees DRGR access and systems troubleshooting. I did also want to introduce Eileen Barnhard. She's one of the grant officers in the Congressional Grants Division. I believe she's on this meeting. Eileen, feel free to introduce yourself if you'd like.
Hello, I'm Eileen Barnhard. I'm, as Connor referred to, a grant officer, and I'm here to assist in any way I can with answering questions. My job is we assist the grantees when they send in their applications, review their materials, help them make any necessary corrections in order to get their grant package through to grant approval process so that they can start their project or activity. Thank you.
And we thank you, Elaine, as well as Connor. Having HUD representatives participate in today's webinar will definitely add value, as each of them has been involved in reviewing grant packages, and consequently they're very familiar with what will get you to the point of being able to spend your grant. The CPF cohort is assembled for you to receive specific guidance that will assist you in just that, satisfactory completion of all grant materials. You were invited to join this cohort based on an award of an FY23 CPF grant. To facilitate and support the cohort, you've been enrolled in a learning management system called Absorb, which is hosted by TDA Consulting. Now, the previous sessions were held on the dates shown here and covered requirements for submission of your grant materials related to project narrative, that is, what must be described in a full project description, budget, how to itemize not only the planned uses of your grant, but also identify sources of funding for the entire project, and then environmental review, when and how to assess the impacts of your project on the environment and vice versa. Today's session 4 on forms and submission will specifically assist you with completing and submitting all the required forms and related content necessary to enter into a grant agreement and then start your community project. To obtain valuable resources on the prior webinar slides, we do urge you to check out the CPF program landing page, as I mentioned before. If you haven't signed up for the HUD Exchange listserv to obtain updates, we urge you to do so. Should you have signed up on the HUD Exchange, you will be notified of information about the CPF program and specifically the availability of the slide deck in case you have not received it beforehand. What specifically will Jennifer and I cover on this forms topic, and how will we address it? Once again, we'll explain guidance based on what's shown here, the FY23 CPF grant guide, just like we did for grant materials related to narrative, budget, and environmental review. The required forms for submission for your grant packet are described in the so-called attachment section of the grant guide. Jennifer and I will detail key forms and instructions, beginning with the standard form 424, or the application for federal assistance, followed by other required forms, and we'll wrap up with the grantee submission checklist that appears in this guide. But first, it's time for a poll that Jennifer will conduct.
Thanks, Randall. Yes, so we have a poll for everyone. We're going to use the chat function actually to receive results for this question that we're going to ask. And we're just curious to hear whether anyone out there has started to assemble your forms for your CPF submission. So in the chat, go ahead and just drop a yes or a no, and then we will get a general sense of where folks are at with addressing the forms component. Thank you all for putting those in the chat.
And Jennifer, it looks like we have a mixture of yeses and nos.
We do. I am seeing more yeses than nos,
Yes.
I think. although now there's more no's rolling in. So I think it's probably a little bit of a mix, maybe around 50-50. Early folks saying yes, and then later folks saying no. But this is good for us to know, because there's still a fair amount of you out there that haven't gotten started. So this is going to be your roadmap to what you need to do. And then for those of you who have gotten started, maybe you have some questions on what you're seeing on the forms, and we'd be glad to take those as well.
And thankfully, we have the two HUD representatives with us who can answer questions when Jennifer and I are stumped.
That's right.
Okay, well, thank you for handling the poll, Jennifer, and we'll proceed now with the key forms and instructions. As I mentioned, the key forms will begin with the standard form 424, or application for federal assistance. Those of you who represent grantees which receive other HUD funding are probably familiar with this standard application for federal assistance. Other grantees are encountering it for the first time. As Jennifer noted in the poll results, this may mean that some of you are more familiar with the form than others. And consequently, we're going to try to walk you through this in detail. First, a description. The SF-424 application for federal assistance is that common application for an organization to receive funding from the federal government, from either the Department of HUD or other departments. It also provides basic information about your organization, which requests those funds be made available through the special appropriation from Congress. As such, your organization is viewed as an applicant. Yes, we understand that you believe you have received the funds, they have been appropriated, but you are being regarded as an applicant in order for this information to be collected. And so you must carefully identify and describe your organization along with the planned community project and its funding source. And as you see here, the application for federal assistance SF-424 is displayed in part on this slide. How can you obtain the SF-424 application for assistance? Well, first you would refer to a page in the FY23 grant guide that is shown here. It's page 11, and it gives you a link that will get you started. And I'm going to actually demonstrate by using that link. I've already clicked on that link, and it's taken me to a HUD web page, which in turn directs me, or will direct you, to the grant.gov page. And I'm going to now switch my screen to share the document of the web page. And you should be able to see now the grants.gov web page, where you would pull down on the forms menu and select, as I already have, the SF-424 family of forms. Now, let me point out, and that is identified over here on the left side of this page of the grants.gov. And then you would proceed to locate this particular form, and the SF-424 form appears right here. And you would click on this icon, on this link for the PDF form itself, and then this link for the instructions. And you would download the form as a result of clicking on those links. This form is updated periodically, so we do urge you to obtain it from grants.gov rather than from any other source that you may have obtained over the course of your involvement with either this program or with other programs. Now I will share this slide presentation again, and bear with me while we go back to the slides, and they should now appear on the screen. Yes. Now, to recap what I just went over, you would download that form, both the form and the instructions, but you can't just stop there and start working on the completion of that form. You need to note the specific CPF instructions that begin on page 12 of the FY23 CPF desk guide, which I identified earlier. So as this slide shows, you will obtain the form and its instructions and then answer the questions as you go through each box as described on page 12 of the FY23 CPF guide. It is, as indicated here, a form that you can fill in on your computer, so long as you have Acrobat Reader. And you would want to then modify the instructions that might be available through the instruction list by following exactly what appears on pages 12 and 13 of the grant guide. You would turn to that following page. And as you will soon note, there are certain boxes on the form that carry with them further instructions that will depend upon your community project funding grant. I will elaborate on this more in just a moment. Now, what you see here are the instructions of that fillable SF424 form, together with the specific instructions and an example of how those instructions will depend on your project. And consequently, you have to pay attention to notes that are in the pages of the CPF desk guide, particularly between pages 12 and 13. If you follow those specific instructions, you also must possess 3 essential pieces of information that have been referenced in prior webinars. 1, the legal name of your organization. And I want to stress that I'm referring to the legal name of your organization. Having been trained as a lawyer, Jennifer knows how that can be different than how an organization may be more commonly known. Second is the unique entity identifier from SAMS.gov, or the UEI. Each grantee, therefore, must have an active registration with SAMS.gov. And then 3, award information from the Joint Explanatory Statement, or JES, from the Congressional Record. Those of you who attended the Project Narrative webinar are familiar with the importance of that statement, and I will be going over it in a bit more detail later on. In fact, we have an activity that will incorporate the importance of that statement, but it is essentially the expression of the intent of Congress in appropriating funds for your community project funding. And it appears in the Congressional Record and is vitally important to align with your project description. After you fill in each box on the SF424 for your project's information, you will then be directed to follow general instructions for certain boxes and instructed to leave blank others. The last specific instruction is for box 21, which refers to certifications and assurances. It also requires your authorized representative to sign and date that form, thereby providing the assurances and attesting that the foregoing information is, as indicated on the right side of this slide, true, complete, and accurate. After completing the SF424 for federal assistance, Your authorized representative then must make those further assurances which fit the type of project or program your community will undertake with its CPF funding. Depending on the project, you must then download and complete one or both of the above forms, which are also available. In fact, you might have seen them when I shared the webpage for grants.gov in that same location. The other forms relate both to your project if it involves non-construction or most commonly services, or to construction, which many of the projects involve, or perhaps both. Each form requires for your representative to provide related additional assurances. So these are supplementary to the SF 424. We urge you to check with your grant officer, if necessary, to determine which of these supplementary forms apply. I also want to pause and note here that HUD has created an enhanced tool to assist in its review of grant packages, and details are coming soon. You may be provided with a little more specific guidance depending on when that added information or enhanced tool becomes available. Okay, I will stop here and see what questions we might have in the chat before I pass the next series of topics to Jennifer. Jennifer, what are the questions that the common and most frequently asked questions that we've received so far?
Well, we've been having a nice chat in the chat about how you download the form for the SF 424. A lot of times folks have trouble with this. I myself have experienced it. But the trick is that you want to have it saved to your computer and then open it through Adobe. Make sure you have the most recent form of Adobe. And thank you, Danny, for the further clarification that when you download the form, it actually saves automatically to your download folder. So you don't have to do anything special to save it. You download it, it saves to your download folder. You go into Adobe, go to your download folder, open the form from that folder that's saved to your computer. And then you shouldn't have any trouble with accessing that form. But it is a little bit of a trick.
That's true. And Jennifer, one other tip that I have heard HUD representative note is that those of you who might represent a grantee who's maybe working with a large organization or perhaps a local or state government where there are security precautions about downloading files, it may be necessary for you to arrange for permission to download files, but most of you should not have any trouble with that aspect. What Jennifer just went over is really the key steps that you would want to take. Just be sure that you do have the current version of Adobe to perform or fill out the form online in this fashion, as well as on the form appearing on your computer. Any other questions? Yes.
This is Eileen. I just wanted to point out a couple of things that we constantly see on the SF 424, and is, make sure that you add your EIN number and your UEI number on that's, I believe it's line 8, I believe. Line 5A is your grant number. On line 14, it says areas affected. Please either put in the address of the project, or if you don't have an address, if it's like you're doing a project that's in an area, then you can put down the county, the city, the town, but you have to put in something. Make sure on line 15 that your title matches your JES statement, and also it would be helpful for you to include a brief project description and your project budget. And on line 18, on the federal funds, is the CPF award. Any other funds that you have into that project must be listed for the total. That total amount needs to be the same amount that's listed on your budget and in your project narrative. And of course, your application needs to be signed by your authorized representative. So that's all I got. Thanks.
Thank you, Eileen. Okay, Jennifer, do you want to handle the next section?
Yeah, let's turn to that. All right, I'm gonna share my screen now. Okay. One quick second. You know, this is always a like.
If you like, I can advance.
Oh, that's okay. That's okay. I got it. It's coming. Okay. Here we go. All right. Let me know when you see that. Do you see it, Randall?
I do
No,
not.
not yet. How about now?
Here we go. Yes.
Awesome. Very good. Okay. So we're going to move on now to talk about some of the other forms that you'll need to complete as part of your submission package. And the first of these forms is going to be the SFLLL, which is your disclosure of lobbying activities form. And then the second is the SF 1199A, which is your direct deposit form. So the the SFLLL, disclosure of lobbying activities. Some folks hear this form and think, well, it doesn't apply to me, I don't do lobbying. But you will need to complete this form, at least in part, even if you don't do lobbying. So if you're an organization that doesn't do any lobbying at all, you're going to note that the form is not applicable in part 10 of the form, but you're still going to complete the form with that information in it, get it signed and submitted with your package. So even if you do not do lobbying, you're still submitting this form. You're just noting that it's not applicable. The form, however, does need to be fully completed if you are using any funds other than federal funds to influence or attempt to influence any officer or employee of any agency of the federal government, any member of Congress, or any person in connection with this federal grant agreement. So again, just to clarify, if you do lobbying, you're going to complete this form in its entirety. If you do not do lobbying, you're still going to submit the form. You're just going to note in part 10 that it's not applicable. Now, if you want to learn more about the disclosure of lobbying form as it relates to this program, you can take a look at the grant guide on page 13. And that's going to explain more about the nuances of this form, why it's required. Links to the form are also on that page of the grant guide. So you want to check that grant guide out, as you should for all of the reasons that we have the cohort program. The grant guide is a wonderful resource. But on page 13 of the grant guide is where you can learn more about the disclosure of lobbying activities form. This form is a form that can be completed on a computer with Adobe. So if you access the form, you can complete it on your computer and then get it signed and submitted. Now the next form is the SF 1199A. This is the direct deposit sign-up form. So this is how you receive your funds. So I think everybody's going to want to make sure you complete this accurately. The grantee themselves will complete section 1 and 2 of the SF 1199A form. These are the grantee sections, sections 1 and 2. The grantee bank or financial institution will complete section 3 of the form. And then you're going to take this whole completed form and email it to your grant officer. You will see at the bottom of this form that it actually says to mail it to HUD, but that is not what we want you to do. We want you to actually email it to your grant officer. Okay, so the bottom of the form is going to say, drop it in a mailbox. You don't want to do that. You want to email it to your grant officer. For more information on completing this form, you can see page 19 of the grant guide. And you'll see here, we have a little screenshot of that page in the grant guide, and it will walk you through the different sections of the form with a little more information on the types of info that you need to put into those different sections of the form. Again, this is a form that can be completed on your computer using Adobe. So nice and convenient. Again, page 19 of the grant guide is going to give you those more specific step-by-step, section-by-section instructions. You're completing sections 1 and 2, and then your bank is completing section 3. You want to ensure that you're including with this form a voided check or a deposit slip, and that you're emailing all of this information to your grant officer. As I said before, this is a form you want to make sure that you have accurate. So before you submit this form, just review and verify that everything on the form is accurate prior to submitting it. Okay, so that actually completes all of the forms that you need to submit as part of your application package. But we wanted to go over one other really useful piece of information, which is the submission checklist. This is not a form that needs to be filled out and submitted. However, it is something that will help you guide your submission. And so we thought it was useful to talk about at this stage. So the submission checklist gives you a list of items that you need to complete in order to make sure you have a fully completed package before you send it into HUD. So on this form, you're going to be able to go down, sorry, it's not a form. On this checklist, you're going to be able to go down each of these checklist items and make sure that you've completed the steps. This is going to be your opportunity to perform a quality check on your submission before your HUD reviewer reviews it. And that's going to save you a lot of time in the long run because it's going to cut down on the back and forth between you and the HUD rep. So this is an optional step. However, it is highly recommended because it's going to ensure that you have a better submission overall. And so you can see that the items on here are a lot of the things we've already talked about in the cohort series. So we'll take a quick look at these items. So we want to make sure that you have an active registration in SAM.gov. And you want to make sure that the legal name of the funding recipient in the SF424 Block 8 is the same as the entity named in the JES or the FY 2023 Act's technical corrections. So you want to make sure that these two things have been completed. You want to make sure that the amount of the requested grant is the same as the amount authorized in the JES. These are just some of the background items that you want to double check for factual accuracy. You want to make sure that your SF424, your SFLLL, and your direct deposit forms are all accurately completed and signed. And then you want to double check your project narrative to make sure that it describes your entire project and indicates the specific activities that will be financed with CPF grant funds. You also want to make sure that that narrative includes all the things that Randall went over in the narrative session. So things like project metrics and timelines and things like that. So then you want to also double check your project budget. And does it include all of the costs related to your grant? You want to make sure that it is consistent with the requirements of the applicable Appropriations Act and cost principles in 2 CFR Part 200. We went over some of these things in the budget session, this cohort number 2 session. And then in terms of direct costs, which we did talk about in the budget session as well, you want to double check, will you be charging an indirect cost to the grant? Yes or no? If yes, are you opting to follow the de minimis rate, which is the default, or do you have a federally negotiated cost rate? And if you do have a federally negotiated cost rate in your application materials, you're going to want to describe the approving agency approved rate and base. And then you want to make sure that Appendix 3 of the grant agreement is filled out. So these are the checklist items. This is, again, a way for you to quality check the information that you're submitting to HUD. This checklist can be found on page 41 of the grant agreement. And here it is in its clean form. You can just take a look at this before you do your submission to make sure that you've covered all of the critical items. So because this is not a required form per se, this form is not fillable, but you can go ahead with your pencil and just make the checks on the piece of paper or highlight it on your screen. Make sure you've covered all the bases, because this is going to guide you in completing a compliant application submission. Now, note that some of the items on the checklist are actual forms that you are going to need to complete and submit, while others are more like action items to quality check that you've completed the necessary things that HUD's going to be looking for in the package overall. So for these things like the narrative and the budget, you want to make sure that just go back to the previous cohort session and cohort slides if you want any further details on those items, or just check the grant guide to make sure that you're covering all of the information that's required. Your application materials are then submitted to your grant officer and to the CPF grants@hud.gov email box.
Okay, Jennifer, before we go to that next slide, I would like to identify a couple of the frequently asked questions that had been raised. One concerns actually what I had covered previously, and it relates to the key elements of or boxes in the standard form 424, the application for federal assistance. Both Eileen from HUD and I think a grantee representative offered a similar recap, but the three items that I had called out as being most important among many important items on that form are: one, the legal name of your organization. And we will actually be, coming back to that point. You referenced how important that is on the checklist that is in a preceding slide here. So that's number one. Number two is the unique entity identifier, the UEI. And this is the identifier that is provided by SAMS.gov to those organizations that have an active registration. So again, as both Eileen and the grantee representative noted in the chat, you must first register with SAMS.gov, receive that unique entity identifier before you can then enter it onto the box that relates to the UEI on the SF424 form. And then the last item, Jennifer, you went over in some detail. I mentioned it earlier, and that is item 3 is the award information from the Joint Explanatory Statement, or JES, that appears in the congressional record. And again, that's key because it expresses the intent of Congress in appropriating funds for your project. And as we've kind of previewed, the activity that we're going to do next focuses on that element, along with a few others that Jennifer went over with the grantee submission checklist that is available at in the FY23 grant guide on the page number that she shared. We had a second question come up, and that relates actually to the 10%. This you mentioned on the form, and maybe you could go back to the checklist form. There was a question about the 10% MTCD, which is down there at the bottom, the de minimis rate. Do you want to explain that one?
So this relates to indirect costs. So you have to note on your budget whether you are charging indirect costs to the grant. If you are, you can just use a de minimis rate of 10%, or you can use a federally negotiated rate. The indirect cost discussion does get pretty detailed, and so I would go back and take a look at the cohort slides for the budget session. There are several resources linked to those slides to further describe how you address indirect costs. So I think that's probably a better use of that. Better use of time is for folks to go back and look at that, because it will be sort of case specific for yourself. But once you take a look at that, if you do have other questions, when we come back to office hours, you could certainly raise them, or if you want to send a message to the cohorts at tdainc.org mailbox, we can follow up with you there as well. But I would take a look at those resources on indirect cost.
And we also have a question related to the typical length of the narrative. I'll take that question since it was covered in the project narrative session. The typical length is just a few pages. HUD is not requiring that you fill out a form that includes the narrative. What they ask is that your narrative fully describe the project, its scope, its intended beneficiaries, and otherwise the purposes for using the appropriated funds from HUD, from Congress that are delivered through HUD, as well as the other sources of funding that enable you to undertake the entire project. So it does depend on how complex your project is. If your project is only doing one item of work in its scope, and the only source of funding is the community project funding, then your narrative would be shorter than that of a project that is quite complex, involves numerous elements in the scope of work, and consequently many different types or sources of funding. One of you actually noted that your project will include donations, for example, and I was pleased to note that you indicated that you have included that funding source in your project narrative and budget. That's the whole idea. And I believe we had a related question that I'll mention now, and welcome either Eileen or Connor to assist. There was a question about where your grant might generate what's referred to in annual formula grant programs awarded by HUD, such as the Community Development Block Grant Program. Do you need to identify program income? And I believe the answer to that question is no. I would like to confirm that, though, with Eileen or whomever else might be available from HUD.
Hi, this is Eileen. I need to know a little bit more. Are you talking about the CBDG program income, or are you talking about the program income generated from your CPF activity?
The question related to the donations of funds, which they regarded at that organization as program income, and that's how I interpreted it, Eileen. It wasn't real clear to me, but as a general rule, let's just look first at the grant itself.
Okay.
Is the CPF grant, should it generate program income? Is it necessary to track it in the same fashion? That's why I'd mentioned CDBG and the annual grants. Of course, that type of program income does need to be tracked, but I'd like
In
you
a
to address.
nutshell, yes, you do have to track your program income and it has to be explained and dedicated. I believe I'm going to look really quickly in my um, guide. I know it talks about program income, but I would also discuss that with the grant officer to make sure, because that does come up, and the program income has to be specified on how it's going to be used, and there's parameters on that. I don't have enough information for you when it's a donation. If the source as a donation versus it's a loan repayment, if that's a different lens on that, but I don't believe so. So I would recommend, just if there's program income, make sure that you include that. I would discuss it with my program officer, and I am going to see if I can find the information. I don't, of course, when I'm on the spot, I don't have it at the ready. So I hope that answers your question.
And that
I
question,
can I jump in really quick? I
sure,
agree
go
with
right ahead.
you. This is Connor. I agree with Eileen. I think it would probably be best for, I think this is for Jennifer Nayenhouse. I'm sorry if I don't say that correctly. I think there may be some nuance to this you may want to discuss with your grant officer, like Eileen suggested. Because the question is, if donations are part of our funding sources and fundraising activities are in the budget, do the donations count as program income and count against the grant funds? I think there's some nuance here as to if these fundraising sources and activities do indeed count as program income, which in my mind would be income that is being generated by the activities that are being carried out under your CPF award.
Yeah.
So I think there's some distinctions that need to be made and hashed out between you and the grant officer. But yeah, I want to put in my 2 cents that I think there's some.
Thanks, Connor. This is Jen Ninehouse, and you did pretty good with my name. I appreciate it.
Okay, great.
Yeah, there are some definite nuances there because we're not paying for fundraising with HUD funds, and then yeah, it's just kind of a place there where 2 CFR 200 didn't look like it was really written to handle the application to nonprofits, where government funding is just a small portion of what we're kind of doing, or anyway, so it's not really revenue, but it is kind of awkward. So we'll talk about it. I appreciate you guys chiming in on that.
Yeah, Jennifer, what Connor is explaining is really the guidance that affects the use of the CPF grant itself. I mean, what Eileen described is the use of that funding, and it would be advisable to check with your grant officer, because each case is different. There are the nuances. If what you were asking about, and I'm rereading your question now, if you're only referring to the donation of funds, and you've identified that in your budget as a separate source of funds that is not being generated by the use of the community project funding,
correct,
then
yes.
it would not be program income.
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate that answer.
You're welcome.
I was kind of worried about it. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, Jennifer, I think that's it on the questions. So I'm going to resume sharing my screen, and we will proceed with the activity.
Are you seeing the screen change here?
I have not yet.
No. Okay. Let me try to reshare.
Okay, I think I'm sharing. That's grantee checklist.
Yeah, you're sharing.
Okay, here we go.
Mm-hmm.
All right. I would now like to set up an example of a community project funding project that illustrates what a typical grantee would ideally do with the grantee submission checklist that Jennifer went over with you, and which you had several fairly specific questions. First, imagine that you are the grantee's representative of a project that I'll identify. And you are assembling all the necessary materials. You've referenced the checklist. You've followed the notes that you've taken in regard to what Jennifer described. And you determine then that you believe your grant package is substantially complete, but you've thoughtfully checked off the boxes, but not all of the boxes. You're in a situation that is commonplace among grantees who are completing their grant package for submission. You're uncertain about certain items. And for that reason, you kind of pause and you don't check off all the boxes. There are a few that you actually hesitate to check off because of issues around them. I'm now going to share with you a one-page document that we've created in regard to ABC Supportive Housing Project. Jennifer, are you seeing the one-pager on the screen?
I am,
Okay.
and I dropped it into the chat as well.
Yes, thank you. And those of you who, we know that there's a lot of information we're sharing. If you want to note what Jennifer just dropped into the chat, it's a PDF file, so you can open that up. And I would urge you to do that because you're going to be asked questions in the poll about what you would do if you represented ABC Supportive Housing. Their project is funded from the FY23 CPF program as indicated here. This indicates that it is the community project funding. It's not any other source of funding. Ordinarily, their state two-letter designation or abbreviation would appear here together with a discrete number and that is the official project number for ABC Supportive Housing. What you see on this one pager begins with a project narrative, which is an abbreviated part of what would be a complete narrative that will pretend ABC Supportive Housing has completed. And they write, ABC Supportive Housing Project will provide housing and services to residents with special needs. Residents will receive drug and alcohol rehabilitation services. The agency is also renovating an apartment building as part of the project and is expanding its operation with support from the United Way. The project is made possible in part by a $1 million CPF grant to ABC Housing Services Incorporated. The next piece of information that the grantee's representative would check would be the joint explanatory statement in the congressional record for the fiscal year 23 budget passed by the Congress. And that so-called JES, it appears in table form. What I've excerpted here is what would be a portion of a page in the congressional record where ABC's project is listed. And there are just these four columns. There's the project column, the grantee column, and the state column, and then the amount column. And what they would do is they would note that there is their project, ABC Supportive Housing Services. They're identified as the grantee, ABC Housing Services. Their state would appear here along with the amount of the CPF grant, which in this simplified example is around $1 million. So that represents the extent of the so-called joint explanatory statement they want to ensure that their grant package, including their project narrative, what appears above here, align. They're using this grantee submission checklist that I'm now going to advance to and go over with you as if we were representing ABC Housing Incorporated and we were trying to complete this checklist. And presumably we have an active registration with SAMS.gov, so we've checked off that one, but we're uncertain if the legal name of the funding recipient is the same as the entity named in the JES or the FY23 Act's technical corrections. The amount requested for the grant appears to match up, but that's not absolutely certain. Going back up here to the top, we have reference to $1 million here, $1 million here. But the project apparently is identified in the JES as services funding for ABC supportive housing in that $1 million amount. The dollars to be used by the grantee named ABC Housing Services. So you can tell why ABC Housing might be a little bit uncertain about whether their JES actually aligns with the way that ABC Housing Services, in fact, wants to use the funding provided by Congress through the CPF program. We do know that the amount's correct, though, and presumably they filled in the SF424, but they're a bit uncertain about those supplemental forms that I'd mentioned. There's one, again, that relates to services. That's the SF424B. And there's another one that relates to construction, which is the SF424D. So they've not checked off both of them. They have also completed the SFLLL, the lobbying form, and properly completed it. But then we get down here to the project narrative describing the entire project and indicating the specific activities that will be financed with the CPF grant funds. Now, if we look back here at the JES and compare it to the project narrative, it says that the project will provide housing and services to residents with special needs. And you see what the services are here. There's reference that the agency is also renovating an apartment building as part of their project. And it's expanding the operation with the support of the United Way. But is it clear how that $1 million CPF grant will actually be used as specified in the project narrative? Here, it seems to indicate that the joint explanatory statement, the intent of Congress, is that ABC Housing Services use their $1 million grant for services. So there is some uncertainty about checking off this item as well. So there are these three potential issues that you would raise in determining whether you have a complete grant package ready to be submitted. So we have prepared a poll now to ask you what you would do in the event that you were representing ABC Housing Services. And I'm going to now switch from this document to the poll questions. And they're threefold. The first question relates to that unchecked item on the checklist. Is our agency, ABC Housing Inc., correctly named on all the legal documents, both the grant materials, which would include the project narrative, and the congressional record, or the JES? And we're going to go one by one. So I will pause here and ask that those of you who are participating, please indicate yes or no here, and I will switch back and forth to help you now. That this is the checklist item that we're talking about, the first one that's highlighted here, where the cursor is, and it directly corresponds to this question: is our agency correctly named on the legal documents? Yes or no? And let's see what the responses are, Jennifer.
Okay, let's see. Got quite a few yeses, a few nos. Let's see, mostly yeses though.
Okay, very good. Yes, it looks like the responses have trailed off. In fact, I don't see any more now. And we will come back to the answer key in just a moment, but most of you did indicate yes there. Now to that second question, is that form, the SF424, the assurances for non-construction, required for our housing service project? And I will scroll back now or show you again what we're referencing here in that question. It's the project grant package and has not definitely included an SF424, which is for non-construction. I gave the example of services. Is that required, and should it be properly dated and executed and included in the grant package? And we'll go back now to the question, and you all may separately answer question number 2. Is that form, the supplemental form for non-construction assurances, required for our housing/service project? Yes or no?
Everyone has said yes so far.
Everyone has said yes. Okay. And that is a question that we'll answer with the key in just a moment. The third question appears here. Number 3 is, do we describe the whole project in detail and the uses of the grant? And I'll switch back now to ABC Housing's excerpt from the project narrative. Do they offer the necessary detail on their housing services project to benefit people with special needs who are being treated for these conditions? They say they're renovating an apartment building, they're expanding operations with support from the United Way, and it's made possible in part, by the $1 million CPF. So the same type of question is raised here. Does our project description cover the whole project in detail and the uses of the grant and presumably any other sources of funds? And what are the responses here, Jennifer?
Everybody says no.
Everybody says no. All right. Well, let's see. I'm going to stop sharing here, and we will advance the slides to the next page, and I will stop sharing this and share that. And here we have the answer to the questions related to, are you ready to submit your grant packet? In regard to that first question, you were correct that the agency is correctly named on all the legal documents in what would be their project narrative, as well as the SF424 application for federal assistance, as ABC Housing Services. That is also the case with regard to the way that the JES describes the grantee name in the same exact name. So that item could in fact be checked off. They are ready to submit in regard to that item of uncertainty. They can determine that that one is complete and check off it. The second, though, this form is required for our housing service project. We really can't tell based on that description. And if that's the case, then they do have a bit more work to do there. It appears that their project funding is for one or perhaps both of the housing and services elements of the project, and consequently, they might need to submit both forms. They would probably want to check with their grant officer. The last question, did they describe the whole project and uses of the grant? You all unanimously said no, which is the correct answer. The uses of the whole project were not described in detail. There was no reference to a budget that would show, as Jennifer pointed out earlier, sources and uses. Not just the grant, the CPF grant uses is appropriate here. They need to identify the full range of sources and uses for their entire project. So in conclusion, we would decide that ABC Housing Services would not be ready to submit their application without describing the entire project, including the budget with sources and uses for both the grant and other aspects of the project that are mentioned in the project narrative. Okay, Jennifer, the next item is questions and answers, but I thought maybe we would pause here and see if there are any questions or comments that those who are participating today would like to raise in the chat, or if you wish, you can come off mute and ask your question about the ABC Housing Services case example.
No questions on the example. Unless
I had
someone
a
was about to
question.
come off mute. Yes, go ahead.
Thanks. I had a question. In the JES, it says that the project is, sorry, I've got to pull it up again. ABC Supportive Housing Dash Services. If the project narrative were to describe only the services portions, I guess I have two-part question here. Does that adequately describe the project then? Because it does go with exactly what it says it is in the JES. JES is a little bit ambiguous, I suppose. And then
what you just said, Jennifer, is the main issue. It is ambiguous. I'm trying to share the document that we created with an excerpt from their project narrative. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Okay, and you're exactly right. They reference in this first sentence that their project will provide housing and services, but they don't specify how the $1 million CPF grant will be used by the legal entity that is correctly named as ABC Housing Services, Inc. They reference that there are components that will be handled as part of the project, and they're saying they'll expand their operations with support from the United Way, which suggests that there's at least a second source of funding. So you're correct, it is ambiguous, and if they were to offer more detail and then, as Jennifer has stretched, include a sources and uses budget that identifies how they are going to renovate the apartment building, it's possible, for example, that element of the project would maybe be funded by other HUD grant funding, maybe a community development block grant.
Right. So I guess what I'm trying to figure out, this is a big question, right? The project narrative is something we're writing, and the JES is what Congress has passed, and that's the law. And then we end up, depending on how we expound upon those 4 or 5 words that are there in the JES, that's what locks us in and gives real meaning to those words. So the fact that she's
confirms
written,
that they're in alignment. You're exactly right.
right. So
And
what I'm
those 4
saying,
words are very important.
yeah, they really are. And so it says services. So to me, the project could be narrowed to include just the services. Am I totally off base there?
Well, the
Because if you,
instructions that we went over in the project narrative webinar emphasize that the grantee should describe the entirety of its project. Why would that be necessary? I'll give you an example. Let's say that the agency is renovating the apartment building as part of its project, where, as you correctly note, they are going to provide services to presumably the tenants or residents who are being also treated for alcohol and drug abuse. Those dollars used to renovate the apartment building might come from a source, like I was indicating in the example, a community development block grant. And if that were the case, certain differences in the way that the CPF grant project would be implemented might arise. There are additional requirements that will trigger where you are using other federal funds in conjunction with, say, in this example, a $1 million CPF. In that example I just shared, where I'm reading into the description that they're going to use other federal funds, they would be subject to federal labor standards because of the CDBG funding. But there is, they have an exemption in complying with labor standards for the CPF grant award. The same situation exists with BABA.
well, and yeah, and that's, I totally understand that. But when we think about this, we're looking, what we get is the JES comes first, and we're looking at the JES and we're trying to make meaning out of that. And it looks like the people who wrote the project narrative, they didn't give enough detail about the services for sure, but they also might have gone beyond the scope of what's contemplated in these ABC supportive housing dash services. It seems to specify, the plain language seems to specify that they mean services related to ABC supportive housing. You could almost make the argument that you weren't allowed to use any of that money on any kind of property acquisition or construction, that it was specifically made for services. So if I wrote this project narrative about just the services that they're providing, and if they took out the whole part about renovating an apartment building, I mean, that would still probably be fine. It wouldn't not, I'm kind of like, what do you guys think about this? About my line of thinking? Am I totally off base, or, and I'm curious to see what Connor thinks too.
The instructions specify that the grantee is to describe the project in its entirety, and it's for the reasons that I just mentioned. In the event that there were other sources of funds included in the funding, and you would admit that they have not specified exactly how that $1 million is to be used, you're right, it can only be used for services. But how does a grant officer who is reviewing this grant package know that that grantee, ABC Housing Services, is going to use the $1 million only for the services part?
Well, and that would be because they gave a budget that would only have the services listed. And I would almost argue that since it says services, if I were to submit a budget that includes things for construction, that those costs may not be allowed, because the way Congress defined the project is that it's a project of services.
That's correct. And for that reason, you are urged to complete a description of the entire project and include a budget, as Jennifer went over in that particular webinar, that shows sources of use and uses for the entire project. If the only source for this project is the CPF grant, and they say that they are going to undertake housing and services, which includes the renovation of the apartment project, then their project narrative does not align with the intent of Congress, which, as you correctly note, is
Okay.
to use the funding only for services.
Right. Okay. Hey, thanks. I appreciate that. Thanks for sticking with me on that logic.
All right. Okay, Jennifer, shall we continue to the end of this webinar?
Sure. There is
You
a
want to?
question.
Oh,
Yeah,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
there was one question about in relation to the exercise. There was a question
Yes.
that asked, since this project is renovation, would they need to complete the SF 424D as well?
They shouldn't. Sorry, right? By my logic, because it shouldn't be renovation. That line shouldn't be in there because
Let's hear
Congress
from
did services. Sorry.
from Eileen. I think it depends on how they would clarify the ambiguous narrative. If it turns out that the source of funding is only to be used for the services, then they probably would not need to fill out the part of the supplemental form related to construction. If, on the other hand, they do anticipate, let's say, for example, the part of their new facility where they're going to deliver the services is being built out in part with other sources of funding, it may be that the grant officer would say that they need to fill out both because it's kind of nuanced to Coach's point. So this is why we say when you're uncertain about whether to fill out both the SF 424B and or D, check with the grant officer because they would have or would obtain necessary details to make a more clear answer to your question. Eileen, is there anything that you would like to add in regard to that nuanced issue?
Oh, am I on? I keep losing you on my screen. I'm sorry. Let me find you where. Okay. Can you find?
Are you there?
I'm trying to. I'm sorry. I got lost here.
Well, the question that one of the participants raised concerns this issue of whether I'll scroll now to the SF 424 related questions. There's the question about using B, which is the supplemental form for services, non-construction. And then there's the question 424D that relates to construction.
No,
And in this instance, I'm noting that we don't have clarity about this project narrative. That's what is kind of the point of this activity. The reason that the entire group of participants in this webinar said no to this last question is because the project narrative does not describe the entire project and indicate the specific activities that we financed implicitly with a sources and uses budget. And consequently, what we said was the correct answer is that you don't know enough to check off that question. And there's a related uncertainty about which of those supplemental forms to include. And so the general advice that Jennifer and I have been offering is, when in doubt, check with the grant officer about which of the supplemental SF 424 forms need to be included.
I'm back. I'm sorry. My system, for some reason, I got kicked out, but I did hear you, but I couldn't get onto the screen. So yes, it doesn't hurt actually if you send in both because we have both forms. We have one grant officer who likes to have both. Specifically for construction, you need the D. If it's services, you need the B.
All right.
So I hope that that is helpful. And I think when the other Jennifer was asking about the JES statement, and she was asking about she's using hers for 100% services, although it references housing. You could simply list that in your project narrative that CPF funding will be used for services and 0% will be used, or $0 for the housing. And if you're doing supportive any type of construction or something else with your supportive housing dollars from another source, you could list that if that's if that's applicable to your total project. I don't I don't have your project, so I don't know. But you can always discuss that with your grant officer. That's what
Yep.
they're there for, and they can help you round that out.
Okay, Jennifer, I'll stop sharing my screen and we'll go back to the presentation.
Alrighty. One second here. Let me get the big view up and share this for everybody. Okay. So we just completed the final session of the cohort series on forms as it relates to the webinars. We do still have another opportunity to meet and answer questions during the office hours session. So stay tuned for that session as well. For those of you who have not started the forms yet and you're starting to look at them now, hopefully this gave you a good roadmap. But as you look at them, you may have more questions. So please join us back at that forms office hours session, and we can answer more of your questions there. The CPF cohort webinar materials are available on the HUD Exchange. It takes a little time for those to get posted, but I believe that the narrative and budget sessions are now up on the HUD Exchange. The environmental ones should be coming soon. So if you do need to look back at those recordings, you'll be able to access those. And then moving on, this is just a reminder about the final office hours session where you can come to ask your questions on March 12th from 2 to 3:30. If you need to contact either Randall or I, you can do that at these email addresses on the screen. You can also always message the cohorts at tdainc.org email account. That's a good place to drop any questions you might have. They'll get routed to the right folks. In terms of some other resource reminders, I think we've talked about these at the end of each session, but just in case you need a reminder, you can identify who your grant officer is at the list of assignments on the HUD Exchange. Again, your CPF program website is your best friend when it comes to finding all of the resources that are currently available for CPF, but also those that are coming, because there are more coming. There will be more desk guides coming, more videos around DRGR, lots of information available on the HUD Exchange. If you need to reach your environmental officer, there's a link for those contacts. And then again, don't forget about the AAQ. The AAQ is there to help you with questions you may have that come up along the way. So it's a wonderful resource, even past the cohorts, that you can use to get your questions answered.
And Jennifer, we do have a question in regard to the CPF office hours session coming up on forms. And the question is, will we be available to answer questions about the forms and submission on that occasion? And the answer is yes. The topic will be forms and submissions. One of the questions asked if we could answer questions about the narrative. We can cover the narrative in the office hours on forms and submissions to the extent that that issue is related to what will go on the project narrative. and correspond with what's on the SF 424, but there is actually a separate, there was a separate office hours session on the topic of project narrative. There's a separate office hours on budget and one on environmental review. So we urge you to take advantage of those opportunities to receive more detailed guidance of what we are able to do. Time permitting is even not only take the opportunity for you to orally ask your question, but we can even look at your draft narrative or your completed SF 424 or a sources and uses budget that you're all trying to include in your grant package before you submit it to HUD for review and approval.
Thank you for that. And then finally, that brings us to evaluation time. So please don't forget to complete the evaluation. It's so helpful to us. You will receive an email from the cohorts@tdainc.org email address asking you to complete an evaluation, but you can do it now by just scanning this QR code. So if you get your phone out, get the camera open, scan the QR code, you can go ahead and complete that evaluation right now so that you know that it's done and we have your feedback.
And before we break, Jennifer, we do have, I see we're right at time, but Eileen, we do have a question about the timing of the grant package's submission. If certain of these forms have been signed in advance, let's say now, and the full package is not completed for a few weeks later, until a few weeks later, let's say the 1st of May, is it okay for them to submit the certification forms that required the signature and were dated weeks beforehand? I believe the answer is yes, so long as those who are making the certifications are still in the position that is that makes them the authorized representative to actually offer those certifications and assurances.
Yeah,
And
this is Connor. I think Eileen dropped off, but yeah, I think if I don't think that there's an issue with you signing, completing those forms, signing them on the date, but then submitting them later. That's fine. Definitely, as long as, like what Randall said, the person who's signing them is authorized to sign all of those forms and submit them to HUD. That would be the only caveat.
All right. Well, we've reached the end of the webinar. Thank you all for your participation, and Jennifer and I will hope to see you when the office hours session is held very soon.
Great.
Goodbye.
Thank you all.